Item: SCP-712. Object Class: Safe. Special Containment Procedures: the light-generating apparatus designated SCP-712-1 is stored fully assembled in a secure storage room at Research Site 14. The room's air is to be HEPA filtered and anyone entering must wear a clean room suit to minimize introduction of dust that could interfere with the optics of SCP-712-1. Anyone making adjustments to the components of SCP-712-1 must wear non-powdered nitrile gloves. Latex gloves are not permitted as Doctor is severely allergic. The vibration-absorbing base of SCP-712-1 is attached securely to a 1.5-meter high table that is securely bolted to the floor of the room. The layout of this secure storage room is an L shape with the apparatus aimed at the far wall perpendicular to the door. No video recording devices are permitted in the room and all cameras viewing the entrance are to be fitted with one Rattan number 90 filter and one linear polarizing filter with the axis of polarization oriented horizontally. The emitting lens of SCP-712-1 is aimed at the rear wall and optical targets should be kept behind the apparatus except during testing. A SWNT forest panel is in place in front of the emitting lens of SCP-712-1 as a component of the fail-secure system. The rear wall of the room is tiled with SWNT forest light-absorbing panels 10. Standard 300-watt metal halide floodlights are aimed at the target wall and are to be turned on no less than 1 hour before SCP-712-1 is connected to a power supply to ensure that the color temperature has stabilized at 5000 K. These floodlights are shuttered as a component of the fail-secure system. A fail-secure system is installed in the room. During operation, the floodlights will be shuttered and the panel in front of the emitting lens will retract. The researcher conducting an experiment must maintain constant pressure on a thumb switch, and a bite plate will detect jaw clenching that may indicate a seizure. If pressure on the thumb switch is released, pressure on the bite plate exceeds normal limits, or power to the system is lost, the shutters covering the floodlights will drop away and the light-absorbing panel will drop into place in front of SCP-712-1's emitting lens. All personnel and test subjects who are present when SCP-712-1 is powered are to be administered vision tests to measure distance vision, near vision, and color perception before entering the room and immediately after leaving. Unless authorized by Doctor in writing and approved by a Level 4 staff member, no individual who exhibits any degree of color blindness is permitted to enter the room. Individuals who exhibit diminished visual ability after an experiment will be held for observation for 24 hours and tested before being released. Any individual who continues to exhibit diminished visual ability after the 24-hour observation period will be prohibited from working with SCP-712 and reassigned to a non-research position for an additional 30 days. Individuals exhibiting diminished visual ability after 30 days will be permanently reassigned. No individual who exhibits any diminished visual ability after 24 hours may be assigned to experiment further on SCP-712. Research on SCP-712 is coordinated by Dr. Dart. Description: SCP-712 is a pair of colors designated SCP-712A and SCP-712B, produced by the light-generating apparatus SCP-712-1. SCP-712A is described by test subjects as reddish-green and SCP-712B is described by test subjects as yellowish-blue. While prior published research into impossible colors had achieved limited success by projecting one of two component colors into each eye of participants, SCP-712A and SCP-712B are each discrete colors. While the colors of SCP-712 can be perceived by human subjects, their wavelengths are expressed as imaginary numbers rather than wavelengths found in the visible spectrum. Specific information can be found in Dr. S. research notes. Subjects who view these colors report feelings of unease or awe, with neither corresponding to particular post-exposure effects. Approximately 26% of subjects experience no effects after viewing SCP-712. Approximately 74% of subjects experience diminished visual ability after viewing SCP-712. Approximately 95% of subjects who initially display diminished visual ability recover within 24 hours. Approximately 1% of subjects who experienced diminished visual ability after 24 hours did not recover. SCP-712-1 is a light-emitting apparatus that was removed from the laboratories of Doctor at University. The apparatus is mounted on a vibration damping base. Components are labeled with stamped metal plates, and a plate at the front of the apparatus is stamped F equals 9907 mm. A cord with 4 wires protrudes from the power supply, which is labeled in permanent marker 220V. The major components of SCP-712-1 are the following. A power supply that connects to a standard US 220V 3-phase outlet. A diode-pumped laser emitter that produces light at Nm. An oscillator-controlled ring electromagnet that surrounds the laser module connected to power by a 2-position switch with positions labeled A and B. A series of beam splitters that divide the beam into 8 optical fibers of varying lengths and arranged in various geometric patterns. A set of 8 fluorite lenses that focus the output of the optical fibers onto the emitting lens. Each lens is mounted on a unique keyed base and fits into one of 2 slots labeled A or B. A 10 cm lens made from a dense material with a refractive index of redacted. This element can be rotated around its optical axis by a metal peg attached to its edge that locks into 2 positions labeled A and B. This is the emitting lens of SCP-712-1. Do not make any adjustments to SCP-712-1 unless you have verified that power is disconnected. If you feel that basic safety rules do not apply to you, I will be more than happy to reassign you to a position in which your risk of injury will be limited to percuts and writer's cramp. Doctor. The main switch, keyed lens bases, and emitting lens are connected to a safety interlock that disconnects power to the laser emitter unless all components are set to either A or B. Common effects of SCP-712. The following effects have been observed in subjects exposed to SCP-712. Perceived desaturation when viewing colors in the visible spectrum after viewing SCP-712. After viewing SCP-712-1A, subjects perceive desaturation of yellow and blue colors. After viewing SCP-712-1B, subjects perceive desaturation of red and green colors. This is the most commonly reported effect. Viewing SCP-712 has triggered severe migraine headaches with visual aura in subjects predisposed to migraines on several occasions. Diminished ability of the subject's eyes to focus visible wavelengths of light while retaining the ability to focus SCP-712 wavelengths. Temporary complete blindness to the visible spectrum has been observed in 2 subjects. Both subjects recovered within the 30-day observation period. Grand mal seizures. Before the recovery of SCP-712-1, Doctor appeared to have suffered a grand mal seizure. During initial experimentation, 2 subjects diagnosed with epilepsy suffered seizures.